Thank you for joining me as I begin my examination of the book God's Not Dead by Rice Broocks from my atheist perspective. Now, allow me to remind those of you who have watched me in this format before, and to inform those of you who may be watching me do a series like this for the first time, that this is not intended to be the definitive response to this book, to Rice Broocks, to Christian apologetics. This is merely my own personal reaction, my own personal review and response, written as I read the book, presented week by week as I read each chapter of the book. I do this both to inform myself of the arguments and thoughts of Christian apologists, and also to inform anyone who might be watching of those same things, and to offer a starting point for fellow atheists of mine who may encounter Christian apologetics or be handed this book or a book like it by a well-meaning Christian relative, so that you have a starting point. I know from experience how difficult it can be to have a book like this just sort of handed to you. And if you haven't really thought about these questions, if you haven't really encountered these arguments before, even though you sort of know that you don't believe it or it doesn't sound right, it can be difficult to put your response into words and to formulate a really strong answer. So I don't expect that you're going to just parrot my answers. I don't expect that you're going to just go to your Christian friends and relatives if these questions come up and just repeat what I say. But hopefully hearing what I say and hearing my thoughts will help you to formulate your own opinion and get your own thoughts together. I am not a trained scientist. I am not a trained philosopher. I am an English major. I have what I would call maybe a semi-layman's fluency, or a layman's semi-fluency, I should say, in many of the subjects that are touched on in Christian apologetics, but I don't have formal training in the sciences or philosophy, and I think that will probably show through as the series goes on. But anyway, let's get started. The book I will be reviewing in this series is God's Not Dead by Rice Broocks. The title may sound familiar to you. It was also the title of a relatively well-known film, especially among the atheist community, last year, the Christian movie starring Kevin Sorbo as the evil atheist college professor. That movie was more like a tie-in to this book. The book came first. This is not a narrative book. It's an apologetics book, but the general premise of arguing for the existence of God and some of the arguments used in the movie are taken from the book. But the movie was a work of fiction, was a work of narrative, and is not an adaptation of this book, just to clear up any confusion. This review that I'm going to offer in the next several weeks will be based on the Kindle edition of the book. That's the version that I'm reading. That's what I'm using to present my notes here as well as read the book. So for your own personal reference, I'm working from the Kindle version. Although the Kindle edition that I have maintains consistent page numbers with the printed edition. So when I present quotations from the book on this side of the screen, they will have page numbers noted. So if you want to look up a reference and you have a print copy of the book, you'll know right where to go. So the author of the book is Rice Broocks. He is a Christian minister. He is the co-founder of a church network called Every Nation, which includes over 1,000 churches. And he also does a lot of campus outreach to college students. He's the author of other books, including Every Nation in Our Generation and The Purple Book. And he is the creator of a proselytizing tool for Christians who wish to share their faith with people, called the God Test, which is sort of a two-sided booklet with 10 questions on each side. And one side is meant to be presented to someone who believes in God, and the other side is meant to be presented to someone who is an atheist or professes no belief. So the book has 10 chapters plus an introduction and a conclusion. Each video in this series will cover a single chapter of the book, with the exception of this first video and the final video. In this first video, I will also cover the introduction. In the final video, I will also cover the concluding material. So the total number of videos in this series will be 10 videos. Now, let's get started with the book, with the introduction, which is subtitled Ground Zero of Faith. Broocks opens the book with an anecdote about a friend of his named Dean, whose Christian faith was shaken after he had a conversation with an atheist. Now, Dean decided to embrace his doubts instead of ignoring them, and to explore the evidence for God. And ultimately, Dean came to a much stronger, more confident faith in Christianity as a result of his conversation with the atheist friend. And you know what I say? Good for Dean, wherever he is. Brooks says he has written this book for people like Dean, people who have felt their faith challenged or who have been plagued by doubts, so that they can answer the challenge made to them and, according to Brooks's belief, to all Christians by the Apostle Peter, St. Peter, in his first epistle in the New Testament, which is to be ready to give an answer to those who question why you have faith. He then summarizes very briefly some arguments that will probably be familiar to those of you who have read apologetics before, or even if you've watched me do a series like this before. Evidence for God and intelligent design is all around. Creation itself testifies to the existence of God. There are no paintings without painters, that sort of thing. And I'll respond to these in greater detail as we get further into the book and Rice presents them in a bit more detail. Brooks says, quote, "I intend to show you the need for the Creator to explain the world around us, as well as the world within us, that is, the human soul." If Brooks is able to do that, it would be quite something, because one of the main reasons why I don't believe in God, and that would be Rice Brooks's God or anyone else's God, is because I see no need to. I see nothing in the natural world that requires the design or the participation in any way of a supernatural being in order to account for it. So if Brooks can demonstrate why his God is an explanatory necessity, that would be quite an accomplishment. I'll reserve judgment as to whether or not Brooks can realize that accomplishment until I finish the book, though I can't help but notice that this book was published 2 years ago, and to date it has triggered no scientific or philosophical revolutions and only one Kevin Sorbo movie. The ground zero of faith, mentioned in the subtitle of this section, is the belief that God exists. Brooks wants to equip Christians to defend their faith with the same confidence and energy with which atheists challenge that faith. And he says, quote, "Make no mistake, the atheists present their case with great fervor. They assert there is no rational proof for the existence of God. The Bible is a book of fairy tales and contradictions, and religion in general is a bad thing. Furthermore, they charge that anyone who is rational and not delusional will come to the same conclusions." Well, Brooks, like most other apologists I've encountered, is treating atheists like a monolith, as though we all believe the same things, and we all use the same arguments, and we all have the same expectations. The lack of evidence for God and the perception of the Bible as man-made and historically and scientifically untrustworthy are fairly common positions among atheists, but not all of us think that religion in general is a bad thing, believe it or not, nor do all of us believe that any rational person should come to the same conclusions that we have. Now, I do happen to think religion is generally a bad thing, but I don't expect that any rational person must necessarily reach the same conclusions that I reach on questions pertaining to the existence of gods or other questions about anything. You can be two completely rational people, you can examine the same evidence, you can ask the same questions, find totally different answers, and it doesn't mean either one of you is irrational. That's kind of just the way things work. So I don't have that expectation as an atheist. Also, while I might describe the belief that a God exists as irrational or as a delusion, I don't think it means that it's a fair description of most religious people to call them irrational or delusional on the whole. I'm not an absolutist about that. I know some atheists are, but not me and not many other atheists that I know. We all have irrational beliefs from time to time. None of us possesses perfect reason or infallible senses. I think religion is false, and I think that religious people are wrong on the questions pertaining to God's existence and the role he has played in shaping the universe and directing our lives and all these religious questions, but I don't think religion is a mental illness. Now, some atheists do, again, but not me. We are a diverse group, in many ways, is all I'm saying. Furthermore, Brooks says of atheists, quote, "Their strategy is simple. use ridicule and mockery to label people of faith as anti-intellectual or irrational. 2. Set up a false dichotomy between science and faith, telling people to choose one or the other. 3. Keep the debate one-sided by not allowing a dissenting opinion in the public arena, making sure the only places where expressions of faith are allowed are in strictly religious settings. Well, tactics number 1 and 2 are common enough, I would say, in the atheist community. As I said, I don't think people of faith are necessarily irrational. I do find a very significant amount of anti-intellectualism, especially among fundamentalists, however. And I and many other atheists do employ ridicule and mockery as a part of our presentations, as a part of our responses to religion. But in most cases, I think that this is better applied to claims and arguments, not to people. I don't really think it's usually fair to mock religious people so much as I would say it's a good idea and useful to mock the claims of religions, that sort of thing, unless the religious people in question are real assholes. Tactic number 3, trying to silence religious dissent, is utter horseshit. However, here in the United States, expressions of faith are most certainly not confined to strictly religious settings, nor, by the way, would most people want to require them to be, including atheists. We don't want to restrict religious expressions or expressions of faith just to churches or strictly religious settings. The issue many of us atheists have is with religious folks who insist that their religious beliefs be admitted as justifications for discriminatory laws, or that their unsubstantiated religious myths be treated the same as scientific theories. That's where we have an issue. Describing secular government and the insistence that the content of school science classes be restricted to actual science is not an example of silencing dissent or trying to push religious people into their own little segregated corner. Many sort of American evangelical Christians will make this charge, but to me that's just typical of the entitled victim playing that is unfortunately typical of many people who are in that group. And for me, it falls under the umbrella of stuff that deserves to be ridiculed and mocked, as mentioned a moment ago. Brooks goes on for several more pages about the spread of Christianity through the Roman Empire, how true faith in God cannot be coerced, how Christianity was originally spread by love and not by the sword, nor by politics, apparently. And then he summarizes the story of the gospel in 5 points. God became man, he lived the ideal life, he died the death we deserved to die for sin, he rose from the dead, and he offers salvation to those who repent and believe. There's your gospel, there's your good news in 5 points. Brooks then briefly recounts his own story, how he came to Christian faith, which will have a familiar ring to anybody who has encountered Christian apologetics before. They all seem to have their coming to Jesus story, and it all sounds like pretty much the same story. As a young person, he came from a religious family, but he didn't think that faith was that important. Then in college, he was overwhelmed by personal issues, and eventually he accepted that the gospel and the truth of Jesus were the only ways that he could find the answers to his questions, and so he gave his life to Christ. That's the very brief version of how Rice Broocks became a Christian. Finally, Brooks closes the introduction by describing the 3 types of people for whom he has written this book: the seeker, the believer, and the skeptic. Quote, "The seeker is attempting to believe but faces doubts whether God is real. The believer knows God is real subjectively but cannot easily articulate this faith to unbelievers. The skeptic may be reading this book from a critical point of view and a predetermined mindset that there is no God." Well, I would be a skeptic then. My position is that there is no God, but that position may be predetermined relative to me picking up this book, but it was not predetermined relative to me being born. I came to this conclusion that the God of the Bible almost certainly doesn't exist, nor do any other gods, for what I feel are compelling, sensible reasons. Now, as we begin chapter 1, let's see if Rice Broocks can convince me that he's done the same for his conclusion that the God of the Bible does exist. Chapter 1, God's Not Dead. Broocks begins this chapter with a story about the time his brother Ben, an atheist, attempted to talk him out of his Christianity. Broocks describes how even though he didn't have brilliant answers to every question that Ben asked, the Holy Spirit moved to soften Ben's heart, and Ben came to see that he wasn't an atheist because he doubted God, but because he knew God was real and was rebelling against the judgment of Ben's sin. At the end of the day, Broocks baptized his brother in a swimming pool, and today, 30 years later, Ben Broocks is, quote, a formidable witness for Christ. So it looks like I can add this book to the teetering pile of other apologetics books that mischaracterize atheists as people who only pretend to not believe in God because they feel guilty and don't want to face up to being sinners. Barely 2 pages into the first chapter, and already Brooks's stated intention to reach out to skeptics of Christianity is made to look either disingenuous or misinformed and misguided. You cannot hope to begin a respectful, honest conversation with someone if you begin by wrongly defining their position and presuming to know their innermost thoughts and motivations better than they do. And yet this seems to be the only method of engaging non-believers of which Christian apologists are capable. Almost all of them have done it. Nearly all of the books I've reviewed in series like this have had a little bit at the beginning where they say, and to you unbelievers, and they make it clear that they are writing partially hoping to persuade unbelievers. And then they immediately show themselves to be completely insincere about that. They're not writing for unbelievers. If there is a common thread running through all of the books that I have reviewed so far, including apparently this one now, it is that thread of disingenuous engagement with unbelievers. They claim that they are writing, at least in part, to persuade skeptics. But the truth is they are not writing to skeptics at all. They are writing to the faithful who want a reassuring pat on the back and a little boost in the faith that they already have. That is the purpose, the true purpose of Christian apologetics, not to persuade, but to comfort and to confirm. Anyway, from there, Broocks turns his attention to the continued growth of Christianity in the face of modern cynicism toward belief in God. See, God's not dead, after all. Despite the influence of secularism and naturalism, there has been a rise in faith worldwide. There has also been an increase in atheist activism. Broocks references the new atheists, though he says that their arguments against faith, ironically, are hardly new. Well, and perhaps that's true. That may be a fair statement to say that the arguments against religion are not new. But that might be attributable more to the lack of new evidence or arguments for religious claims than to a lack of imagination on the part of atheists. The tedious sameness running throughout virtually every book I've reviewed in this format, including this one already, suggests that apologetics isn't exactly a hotbed of innovation and original thought. Broocks summarizes the atheist argument as he sees it. Quote, "Atheists claim that the universe isn't what you would expect if a supernatural God existed. All this death and suffering, they say, are plain evidence that a loving, intelligent God could not be behind it all. The truth is that God has created a world where free moral agents are able to have real choices to do good or evil. If God had created a world without that fundamental choice and option to do evil, then we wouldn't be having this discussion." And that's the problem of evil, which I'm sure many of you recognized right away, which is a compelling argument against the common Christian claim that their God is benevolent and loving, but it isn't exactly an argument against the existence of God. Brooks's response, which is the free will argument, doesn't account for the suffering caused by non-human actions, such as natural disasters, nor does it account for the cruelty inflicted by God himself, or by humans acting on God's command, which is depicted in the Christian scriptures, which Rice Broocks would say is a genuine historical record. And even if Brooks's answers to those questions were satisfactory, there are still plenty of reasons to find a naturalistic view of the universe more plausible than one where a supernatural God played a vital role. Brooks's theodicy, if accepted, might answer the problem of evil, but it still doesn't render the existence of God a necessary condition to account for or to understand the universe. Brooks addresses the issue of truth. He says, quote, "Truth is another word for reality. When something is true, it's true everywhere. The multiplication tables are just as true in China as they are in America. Gravity works in Africa the way it does in Asia. The fact that there are moral truths that are true everywhere points to a transcendent morality that we did not invent and from which we cannot escape." What does Brooks mean by moral truths that point to a transcendent morality we didn't invent? Well, quote, "For instance, lying is wrong everywhere. So is stealing. Cruelty to children is wrong regardless of what culture you're in or country you're from. When these laws are broken, people are broken." Well, lying or stealing or cruelty to children being considered wrong everywhere is not evidence of a transcendent morality that we didn't invent. It's evidence of commonly accepted moral principles. There's no reason humans couldn't have invented these principles for ourselves, or that these principles can't be rooted in our biology, our brains, and our cultures instead of in some divine moral lawgiver. In citing broadly agreed upon moral principles as evidence for a transcendent, divinely created morality, Brooks ignores the fact that A, there is not unanimous agreement over what constitutes a lie, or an act of theft, or an act of cruelty against a child, and B, there are many acts which are considered abhorrent in some places and permissible in others. The moral permissibility of a certain act can evolve significantly throughout time as well. If an act that was tolerated 200 years ago is considered to be a terrible crime today, does that lack of universality mean that it isn't really wrong? I imagine Brooks would try to slide past these questions by asserting God as the unchanging moral lawgiver, not human cultures. But then the question becomes, how does Brooks know what God's moral laws are, and is his source for that knowledge to be trusted? Is atheism a religion? Brooks asks. Yes, apparently. Quote, "Atheism as a religion, a set of beliefs, is just as intolerant and close-minded as the claims made against any faith system it assails." Well, how is atheism a set of beliefs rather than a single belief, or the lack of a single belief? And I'm not trying to be a stickler about this, because I know there are broader worldviews that are atheistic, but atheism itself is usually defined simply as that single belief or non-belief. Atheism is not a generally agreed upon set of beliefs and rituals, the sort of thing that you would typically think of a religion as being. Also, about that definition of religion, how is a set of beliefs an acceptable definition for a religion? Are all sets of beliefs religions? Because depending on how you look at it, virtually any ideology or philosophy or scientific theory or school of criticism could be considered a set of beliefs. So does Brooks mean to imply that every belief of every nature can be fairly called religious? Wouldn't be the first time I've heard that either. This, again, is hardly a fresh tactic, attempting to undermine critics by arguing that their acceptance of atheism or science or what have you is just another form of religion is as basic to apologetics as the forward roll is to gymnastics. Brooks continues, quote, "Therefore, in their minds, science becomes the only source of truth. Like a ruthless dictator in a third world country, atheists must eliminate all competition. No deviations from the atheistic Darwinian dogma tolerated. Want to lose credibility in these secular citadels? Merely suggest that there might be something beyond nature that's responsible for our existence. This skeptical overreaction is simply unreasonable. By the way, the ellipsis in that quote is not mine. It's Brooks being melodramatic. Well, whether or not we consider science to be the only source of truth depends very much on what we mean by truth. If you're including more abstract notions of truth, then sure, we can derive truth from non-scientific means. We can derive truth from things like art and music and poetry, that sort of thing, emotional truths. And these sorts of truths are very important. I don't reject them or deny them at all. But if we're talking about truth about the world, if we're talking about gaining knowledge and gaining facts about the world around us, about what is the nature of our existence, about how things work, about where things came from, I don't understand how we're supposed to learn anything about any of that through something other than the scientific method. And if a religious person is making claims about the nature of our existence, or the purpose of our lives, or the way the universe works, or where we came from, that are based on things which have not been or cannot be established scientifically, I think it makes sense to reject those claims, or at the very least to withhold belief in those claims unless and until there is evidence compelling us to accept them. I don't think that's being unreasonable. I don't think that's being dogmatic. And I don't think that that's being unfair to religious beliefs or to religious people. How is it reasonable to demand that unsubstantiated claims about the nature of the universe be given consideration equal to or better than substantiated claims? Brooks responds to the "who designed the designer" argument by saying that you don't need to have an explanation for every explanation. Otherwise, you wind up with an infinite regress where nothing is truly knowable and science and reason break down. Isn't that a nice reversal that he's attempting there? Usually it's the atheist or the skeptic of religion who tries to present the theistic claim as leading to an infinite regress, but Rice Broocks has cleverly reversed it and said that it's actually that question, who designed the designer, that leads to the infinite regress. Well, this is one of the inescapable philosophical problems with science and with how we experience and comprehend the world generally. Absolute certainty is unattainable, and science and reason do break down at certain philosophical extremes, just as general relativity eventually breaks down when we try to apply it to objects like black holes or to events like the Big Bang. That doesn't mean that science and reason are useless or not to be trusted, and it doesn't mean that things are unknowable. It just means that our capacity to comprehend the universe is limited. Though, thanks to science, not religion, that limitation is moving further and further out every single day. The boundaries are growing constantly. Here's why you can't dispose of the "who designed the designer" question by merely declaring that God doesn't need a designer, which is what Brooks does, which is what most Christian apologists do. They just simply define God as being uncreated, and they say, there, stops your infinite regress right there. There's no necessity, either scientifically or philosophically, for an intelligent designer to be there at all. Sure, you can assume that God created the universe, and you can define God in such a particular way that it sort of fits into all of our scientific knowledge, and you can say, there, see, there's God. You can't prove he's not there. You can do that if it makes you happy, but you can make sense of things without that assumption. It has no explanatory power. And since the assumption has no explanatory power, and since there is no evidence compelling us to make that assumption, there's no reason to stop with that assumption once we have made it. If you're going to explain the universe by positing an unnecessary and unaccounted for God, why not explain the existence of that God by positing something else behind that? Who designed the designer is not a gotcha question meant to stump creationists and apologists, although they nearly always treat it as such. It's a way of demonstrating the essential flaw of the original claim. If you're willing to add assumptions without necessity once, there's no reason to ever stop. And it gets you nowhere. It gets you no closer to a good explanation of whatever you're trying to explain. Next, Brooks makes an appeal to popularity. If so many people believe God exists, how can they all be wrong? He then insists that, unlike the popular analogies like fire-breathing dragons or the tooth fairy or the flying spaghetti monster used by atheists to challenge believers, there are actually good reasons to believe that God exists. He says, quote, "The real question is, how much proof is enough proof to convince you that God is real?" When Richard Dawkins was asked this during a public debate, he said, "That's a very difficult and interesting question because, I used to think that if somehow, great big giant 900-foot-high Jesus with a voice like Paul Robeson suddenly strode in and said, 'I exist, here I am.' But even that, I actually sometimes wonder whether that would." He doesn't appear to have given much thought to this trivial answer. In fact, if someone else claimed to see a 900-foot Jesus, he or she would be ridiculed. And so they should be, Mr. Brooks, unless it was a credible claim. And what would make it a credible claim? Well, if other people saw the giant Jesus, if the giant Jesus was recorded by cameras and microphones, if the giant Jesus was able to be touched or left behind lasting evidence that it had been there that could be examined and shared with people and used to verify that it had been here. See, evidence can make credible even claims which seem utterly outrageous when we first imagine them. Someone claiming to see a 900-foot Jesus with no evidence that it was actually there, yes, that is a claim deserving of ridicule. But many people claiming to see a 900-foot Jesus, with their claims all largely in agreement and backed up by solid, verifiable evidence, suddenly it becomes a credible claim. But I agree with Dawkins. Even if 900-foot-tall Paul Robeson Jesus suddenly showed up, it wouldn't suggest to me necessarily that God must exist. And this is actually kind of a tough question. What evidence would be enough to convince you? It's difficult to imagine evidence that you would look at it and you would just go, "Oh, holy shit, there must be a God." It's difficult to imagine. The best answer I have is one which I've heard before from many other atheists, which is, if God is there, being omnipotent and omniscient, he would know what evidence would be necessary to demonstrate his existence, should he ever care to convince me. One of my favorite phenomena that I encounter over and over and over again when studying apologetics is projection. When the apologist disparagingly ascribes to the atheists or the skeptics or whoever he is responding to attributes that he exhibits himself. Here's Rice Broocks' first example of that phenomenon in this book. Quote, "The truth is, if your mind is made up about what you don't believe and won't believe, then no amount of evidence will convince you. You will dismiss even the most devastating testimony against your position." And when Rice Broocks tells you that sort of thing, you can trust him because he is speaking from experience, whether he realizes it or not. Brooks contrasts the theistic worldview with the naturalistic worldview that is espoused by atheists. He quotes Greg Graffin, who is one of the founding members of Bad Religion, and Steve Olson, who was his co-author in the book Anarchy Evolution, where they describe naturalism as the philosophical perspective that the physical universe is all there is. And to this, Brooks says, quote, "This worldview eliminates the possibility of God from the outset. Therefore, no evidence for an intelligent creator will ever be convincing." Here's the problem. Not all naturalists are as dogmatic as Brooks is making them out to be. In fact, I would go so far as to say that most naturalists are not that dogmatic. I would go even farther as to say that even the authors whom Brooks quotes to describe naturalism are not that dogmatic, even if we judge them solely by the quote from their book that is reprinted in Rice Broocks' book. Here is how Graffin and Olson define naturalism in their book, as quoted in this book by Rice Broocks. Quote, "From a philosophical perspective, naturalists believe that the physical universe is the universe. In other words, there are no supernatural entities or forces acting on nature because there is no empirical evidence for anything beyond or outside of nature. And that again is Greg Graffin and Steve Olson writing in their book Anarchy Evolution. Now, I want you to note the final clause of the final sentence of that quote. Because there is no empirical evidence for anything beyond or outside nature. Graffin and Olson make it clear that they are naturalists because they see no evidence compelling them to believe in the existence of the supernatural, not because they have eliminated the possibility of God from the outset, as Brooks seems to want us to believe that they have and that all naturalists do. Now, I will award Brooks a point for quoting Graffin and Olson completely enough to avoid quote mining them, and then I will subtract that point for Brooks apparently failing to read to the end of his own quote and therefore sounding like an idiot. Next, Brooks ponders the implications of a godless universe. If God is dead, he says, then man is dead, because without God's moral law, nothing is ultimately right and wrong. If there is no heaven, Brooks asks, why sacrifice your life to a greater cause? And if there is no hell, well, that means that terrorists will ultimately get away with their crimes. Atheists and others whose beliefs don't include eternal life after death devote their lives to greater causes, even at the cost of their lives, every day. If Brooks honestly believes that in the absence of an eternal heavenly reward, there is no reason for anyone to sacrifice for a greater cause, then so much the worse for him, and shame on him. And sure, if there's no hell, then terrorists do get away with their crimes. Until they die. It's not as if they get to live forever in bliss because they blew up some buildings. In fact, if they want to do that, they have to convert to Christianity. How is a group of terrorists committing some horrible crime and then dying and passing into oblivion so much worse than someone committing absolutely awful atrocities but repenting and accepting Christ at the end of his or her life and being granted eternal salvation? Brooks briefly tiptoes through the familiar Christian charge that atheism is to blame for the atrocities and oppression of dictators like Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao, and then he moves on to atheists like Bill Maher, who argue against religion by appealing to fanaticism. Brooks says fanaticism is a human problem, not a religious one. And you know what? Fair enough. But if Christianity shouldn't be judged by its fanatics, why should atheism be judged by the despots that Brooks attempts to hang upon it? Brooks shares the lesson that he took from 9/11. Because really, how are you going to write a book arguing for the existence of God without referencing 9/11? Am I right? That lesson was that not all religions are the same. The loving God of his faith, he insists, would never inspire people to fly planes into buildings as those Muslim terrorists believed their God did. Nope. Not the God of the Bible. The thing is, though Brooks insists that his religion is true and the religion of those Muslim terrorists is false, the evidence to substantiate the claims of both religions is equally absent. Brooks can claim his God is the real God all he wants, but if a violent extremist Muslim claims his God is the real one instead, there's no objective way to settle that dispute. It's just two guys waving their respective scriptures at one another. Also, the God which Brooks insists would never inspire people to commit atrocities is the same God which, according to the book Brooks considers to be Holy Scripture, not only inspired people to commit atrocities, but committed them himself. The crimes of Al-Qaeda pale next to the crimes of the God of the Old Testament, assuming that those crimes actually took place. Brooks declares Jesus Christ to be the greatest idea in history. And then he closes the chapter by asserting that God's existence matters because he deserves recognition for what he has created, which would be everything. God created the whole universe. Quote, God deserves the recognition for all he has created. Knowing that a creator exists changes everything in our outlook and worldview. It should inspire us to honor him more than we would honor any woman or man for any human achievement. It should also cause us to seek him, to earnestly desire a relationship with him. Neither Brooks nor millions of other Christians may find it at all unseemly that the all-powerful God of the universe is not content to allow his creation to speak for itself, but through Scripture repeatedly demands our constant recognition, gratitude, and devotion. But I find it unseemly. I question whether any being which was truly transcendent and all-powerful would make such demands, and I deny that any such being which does is worthy of respect, let alone worship. Well, that's it for Chapter 1. That was a nostalgic stroll through the apologist trope neighborhood of memory lane, wasn't it? I mean, he sprinted through so much stuff. There was the mischaracterization of atheism. There was blaming atheists for Hitler and Stalin. There was the evidence is all around you in the universe. There was atheists are only pretending not to believe in God because they are guilty of their sin. I mean, look, just think of, maybe this is a good sign. Maybe because Brooks ran so quickly through so many common apologist tropes in the first chapter of his book, maybe the rest of it is going to be fresh and new. I mean, I can hope, right? Anyway, in the next video in this series, I am going to take a look at Chapter 2 of God's Not Dead, which is titled Real Faith Isn't Blind. So that's in the next video. Thank you guys for watching. Those of you who are coming back to this, who have watched me do this before, thank you for coming back. Welcome back. It's good to be doing this again, even though it is somewhat of a trial sometimes to read this stuff. Those of you who are watching for the first time, welcome. I hope this is of some use to you, whether you are an atheist or a Christian or whatever. I hope that you get something out of this, that this is of interest to you, that you find it entertaining and valuable in some way. Please leave a comment on this video. Clarify some points I was trying to make that maybe I could have done better. Ask me some questions. Agree, disagree, whatever you want to do. Any responses are appreciated. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.